What about the people that say we're seeing the beginning of the next big extinction event?
It's so stupid. We're not seeing the beginning of the next big extinction event. Okay, if a big extinction event was happening and it was being documented, I could get it. But read the chapter in my book on extinction where I appeared before a committee of the U.S. House of Congress with 3 people there claiming to be United Nations scientists, saying that, yes, we only know of 1.7 plus million species, which have been identified, named, photographed, written up, etc. But there are very likely 8.7 million species. That's what they said. There's probably 8.7 million species, and this is our best estimate. Where did they get that estimate? Thin air. There's no way you can turn 1.7 into 8.7 without having any actual observation of any real thing. So they were saying there's about 7 million unreal species that we don't know about. And then they say, and 1 million of those will go extinct in the next few decades, right?
How many of the observed creatures have they seen go extinct?
An ever decreasing number. As humans in around 1920, when the passenger pigeon became extinct, suddenly the general population took an interest in the issue of extinction. Prior to that, which wasn't very long ago, 100 years, nobody cared about extinction. They thought it was a normal thing, except a few naturalists who bemoaned the extinction of the dodo bird or other species that went extinct as a result of human activity. And most people don't realize that the main cause of species extinction is not hunting, right? It is actually agriculture and the changing of habitats. So that is why most species recovery programs are based on habitat and making sure that there's a place for these species to exist. That's key. But we have not overrun 90% of the world's habitat, and much of the area that we are using, especially for forestry, is perfectly suitable for most of the species that always lived in the forests. Agriculture is different. Agriculture creates a monoculture on purpose, and that's pretty hard to get away from. People who preach that you should have 17 different species of plants growing on the same plot of land, I'd like to see them do it successfully. It's not possible. So the farmer wants to get rid of every insect, every animal, everything other than every other plant. All other plants are weeds in this case. And so agriculture is where you have to really look at what you're doing in the landscape and make sure that in that landscape, and it usually happens naturally. If you fly across the whole agricultural area of the United States, you see lots of forest interspersed among the agricultural land, and Europe too. I mean, most people don't realize that 250 years ago, less than 10% of Europe remained forested because the trees were being used for everything to do with fuel. They were being used to heat all the buildings, to smelt all the iron and copper, to do the glass works and steam engines. Everything was fueled by wood and all the building of everything. So forests started to disappear in Central Europe initially and then spreading out over the whole of Europe. The first time in the history of humans where forests were disappearing. We were cutting them faster than they were growing back. That's why agriculture was invented 10,000 years ago and forestry wasn't invented until about 1750 in Central Europe, because they realized they had to start planting some trees. And then silviculture, otherwise known as forestry, scientific forestry, came into being. And now there's 43% forest cover in Europe.
Well, speaking of trees, I thought the Amazon rainforest was wrecked.
10% of it has been modified.
That's quite a lot. That could be quite a bit. It's a fair big forest, isn't it?
It's a huge forest, and it's not in any way endangered. The problem with my book is titled Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom for a reason I put the word invisible in there. Because to most people, the Amazon is invisible. They show you a picture of a fire that takes up the whole screen, right? It might be about 10 feet of the Amazon. which is almost as big as the continental United States. Brazil itself is almost as big as the continental United States, and Amazon is a huge part of Brazil. And there are parts of the Amazon that have been developed, but most of it is intact. And even where it's been developed, it is only small areas. If you just look at a satellite photograph of it, you can see it. I've flown over it in an airplane at fairly low elevation, and you go for 5 hours and you hardly see any people. It's called a human desert by people. But even the leader of Brazil now is under attack over the Amazon from the left. And one of the reasons you can get away with that is almost no one in Brazil has ever been to the Amazon, even though it's in their own country. People don't go there. What would you do there? It's got Manaus, which is basically a manufacturing hub for electronics. So it's a sort of a tax-free zone of some kind. You've got Belém at the mouth of the river, which is, I've been to that city. It's not very interesting. It's just a city at the mouth of the Amazon. And there's not much else to do there. You can go on a boat up and down the river. And then all you see is trees the whole way. And the Amazon is 300 miles wide during the flood period. It will never have a bridge over it. It doesn't have a road anymore because the plants grew up through the pavement and destroyed the road within 10 years when they did build one to Manaus.
I'm going to guess that if we continue to increase the concentration of carbon dioxide, that's just going to happen quicker.
Yes, the Amazon is growing faster. But interestingly, it's the drier places that benefit most from increased CO2 because increased CO2 has two effects. One, more CO2 for growth. Like, I'll give you the second one in a minute, but first I digress to say that I used to laugh at people who said their plants grew better when they talked to them, as if plants have ears and can hear you and are empathetic or whatever. And I sort of chuckled at that. Then I realized that when you're talking to your plants, you're breathing 40,000 parts per million CO2 on them. That's our breath, is 100 times the level it is in the air. So you're basically breathing super concentrated fertilizer onto your plants when you're talking to them, and they do grow better because of that, because they would like to have more CO2 than exists in the natural world today. The second thing that increased CO2 does is it makes most plants more efficient with water, because now it's easier for them to get the carbon dioxide they need because it's more concentrated in the atmosphere. And therefore, they don't need to make as many holes in the bottom of their leaves. They're called stomata. It's where they take in the air with the CO2 in it. But it's also where they lose water through transpiration. So the fewer of those holes there are, the less water they lose. Therefore, the more efficient they become with water and gives them the ability to survive in places that have less water than they could before. That's why trees are marching out onto grasslands in many parts of the world, the southwest of the US, for example, and Australia. The very eastern part of, the very western part of Australia, Western Australia as it's known, is the driest part of Australia. The Nullarbor Desert is there too, which doesn't have much of anything growing on it because it's so dry. But in the west, like around Perth and down to Albany, the trees are growing much faster now, and so are the crops, because if you're a farmer today and you are giving your plants all the water and all the fertilizer they need, the mineral food, the limiting factor to the plant's growth is carbon dioxide because of how low it is in the atmosphere even today. And the proof is in the pudding here, because all commercial greenhouse growers in the world inject carbon dioxide into their greenhouses because they have an enclosed space where they can increase the level of CO2, and they generally go up to between 800 and 1200 ppm, which even above that, the plants grow faster, but there's a curve because economics is involved. They have to buy the CO2. So at this level, at right somewhere in the curve, they say, okay, 1200 is optimum for us, because above that, buying more CO2 has an ever decreasing increase in yield. And so 1200 works really well in greenhouses. That's 3 times what it is today in the global atmosphere. And that is, we should not even be concerned until CO2 gets up to 20,000 ppm, because that's what submariners survive in for 3 months underwater. And the people who had the trouble on Apollo 13, where the CO2 was building up, it went up to at least 20,000 in there. See, our breath is 40,000. We have 40,000 ppm CO2 in our lungs just before we breathe out.
I don't want to be breathing that in, though.
Yes, you do.
What, the same air that I breathed out? Well, in that case, you could
just once. Just once.
Yeah, but you don't want to be a closed system of breathing that back in.
Yeah, when you put your mask on, you are breathing a significant portion of the air you just breathed out back in again. Mm-hmm. So we can survive at a whole different bunch of levels of CO2 just fine. And plants are happy with it at 10,000 ppm, or they wouldn't be here, because that's what it was back 500 million years ago.
What's happening, people? Thank you very much for tuning in. If you enjoyed that episode, then press here for a selection of the best clips from the podcast over the last few weeks. And don't forget to subscribe. Peace.